Psalm 22. Wow, what can I say about Psalm 22? The iconic lament psalm, one that began in David's distress and ended up in Jesus's agony. Psalm 22 is fantastically beautiful and devastatingly brutal. But interesting, and for our contemplation, it is very important for us to have Psalm 22 in our toolkit. There are sometimes that only Psalm 22 or psalms like it that can meet us in the dregs at the bottom of life. And David certainly was in that predicament. Although we don't know exactly in his life which trial he is in, could have easily been inside the almost decade that he was on the run in exile before he was coronated king. It could have been when he was exiled again, when he was the dethroned king, or at least his son Absalom tried to make it so. Probably in the first batch of exile years, he was chased, he was hungry, he was in the desert. He had to take care of not only himself, but several hundred other ragtag people that followed him there in the wild. Lament does something that is interesting. Lament lives in the space between what is and what seems. Sometimes that gap is big, sometimes that gap is small, but there's always a gap. There's always a gap. And because there's always a gap, there's always a place and a requirement of faith. Faith lives at least some of its life inside that gap. David is forced into that spot. He did not want to go there. You can see from his language that he is surprised to be there. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" There's an address to God as my God. There is relationship, and yet it's somewhat strange. It's somewhat formal. It's somewhat stretched. He doesn't say any of the other poetic names. He simply cries out, my God, in the doubly emphatic. Why are you so far from saving me? You've saved me in the past. Why are you far from doing it right now? Why are you far from the words of my groaning? David's words had risen to the Lord so many hundreds of times in the sheepfold, or out in the among the stars, or when he looked at the heavens and they declared the glory of God. His words of groaning had always received an audience, and it seems like he wasn't getting an audience now. Oh my God, he says in verse 2, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Sometimes that's the most restless situation, to have a previously vivid and vibrant relationship with the Lord to somehow fall stale and stagnant at the worst possible time. David is in that predicament, and he does not know what to do. But instead of running from God with his disillusionment, he runs to God with his disillusionment. And he says, what do I do with this? How do I make sense out of this? And that's when his perspective changes. So he addresses the Lord, and that's kind of the loop of all lament psalms. They address the Lord, they give their complaint, they deliberate somehow in their theology and their experience. They somehow have a deliberation interaction with God or with a theology that's already front-loaded into their brain. They deliberate, and then they pivot. And that pivot is what makes lament so much more different than just mere grief. Everybody grieves. Everybody suffers. Most people grieve. Some people won't. Most people grieve, but only a few lament. Only a few pivot in that deliberation and pivot toward relationship instead of pivot away from relationship. And that's the kernel of faith. That's the kernel of faith that David and so many others have, that they take their woe, they take the words of their groaning to God, instead of take their words of their groaning away from God and use it to accuse God back over their shoulder as they run away from him. But the pivot comes, and there's several loops through Psalm 22. The pivot comes when he says, yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. And he's widening his expanse. He's enlarging the narrative. It's not just him. It's not just him running for his life. It is now he is one of many. who have been in suffering. And yet, even in the past, in the wider community of the people of Israel, the Lord has been praised, even in times of distress. And so David, he is the forsaken one. He goes on and he says, I am a worm, verse 6. I am not a man. I'm scorned by mankind and despised by the people. So he's the forsaken one. He's the despised one. He doesn't understand it. His life has been upright as far as human categories can put forward, but he is despised and he doesn't know why, and yet he is. Verse 16, it's even more than that. He says, the dogs have encompassed me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. David certainly is foreshadowing in his prophetic sense, something that is worthy of a different talk. But even in his own experience, he is finding that climbing over the jagged rocks of the wilderness of Judea has scraped his hands to a sensation of being pierced. And yet, verse 19, but you, O Lord, and there's a pivot again, but you, O Lord, do not be far off. He's already said, why have you forsaken me? But faith has now joined him at the bottom of life. He lifts up his eyes from his predicament to his Savior, and he says, be not far off in a prayer. You, my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword and my precious life from the power of the dog. And he says in verse 21, you have rescued me. And he's not rescued yet. I love that. He is so sure now, even though he's still conflicted. The tears on his face are still wet. And yet by faith, he says, you have, past tense, rescued me. Now, maybe he's thinking about other times, but I think he's applying it to that predicament he's in. He, by faith, is going to narrow the gap by faith between what is and what seems, and he's going to let God declare what is instead of he himself, his experience, his emotions, to say what seems. He's going to push down the seesaw of faith so that the evidence of leaning into God is going to win. That's faith. That's faith. He's the rescued one. And just finishing up quickly, verse 24, he's the heard one. And then verse 26, he's the satisfied one. Fantastically important and hopefully enriching.